Today we're going to have what I hope is a very interesting conference that will talk a good bit, maybe on the more optimistic side of journalism. There was a, can you hear me okay, by the way, in the back? There was a story in the news today, the Boston Globe and the New York Times, about the Christian Science Monitor deciding that they were in April going to stop publishing that newspaper, well over 100 years old, and they will be shifting all their energies onto the web, with the exception of doing a weekly paper. And in some ways, the suggestion being that that is the future of at least the model for the newspaper model, and it may well prove to be. But the downside of seeing the dramatic shift in, particularly in newspapers, and this holds true also for broadcast television, has been the loss of the long story form, narrative journalism, and it's the kind of journalism we really associate often with investigative journalism. It probably hasn't been since the era of the muckrakers, again about 100 years ago, that we have started to see a shift and a dramatic revival in the book as the new form of journalism, the book being used in some cases perhaps to take the place or certainly to supplement and complement what for many years we had come to rely on newspapers to do, that long-form journalism. So that's largely what the discussion is going to be about. We will hear this morning from a distinguished panel. They will be introduced in just a few minutes. We're delighted to have our luncheon speaker today is Isabel Wilkerson. Sorry, where did Isabel go? She's right there, right next to Lou, and we're looking forward to that. Isabel has just finished a book, and she's a professor at Emory University. And then this afternoon we'll have a panel of people from the business side of book publishing to talk about the viability of this new form of journalism in the book. So I think all in all, it should be a fascinating day. But it's my pleasure to introduce to you perhaps our most distinguished professor when it comes to long-form narrative journalism, Carol Rivers. Carol, please come up, and Carol is going to introduce our moderator.
I'm very pleased to introduce Fox Butterfield. I must say at first that one of his great credentials is as father of Sam, former high school star pitcher, and now aspiring journalist. So we won't say what school he's in, but it isn't Boston University, but that's okay, we forgive him. Fox has been for a long time a distinguished journalist, Pulitzer Prize winner for his work on the Pentagon Papers, New York Times correspondent around the world. He's the author of a number of books. China Alive in the Bitter Sea won the National Book Award. He also speaks fluent Chinese. He's shifted his focus. He was in Boston for a number of years as Times correspondent. He has recently been very interested in crime and its roots. And his book called All God's Children, The Boston Family and the American Traditional Violence, really looked at a southern black family and the roots of violence there. He's now at work on a book, and he was just telling me a bit about this family in Oregon that he's looking at, which has several dozen members of the family in prison, and he's looking at the work of some sociologists who found many years ago that half of all people who were incarcerated had parents who were incarcerated. So I think the idea of the familial roots of crime is something we've been looking at, and he was telling me about this family, and the paterfamilias has the name of Rooster Bogle or Bogle, is it? Bogle, Rooster Bogle. So without the further ado, I give you Fox.
Carol, thank you very much. Can people hear me? Is this working? So everyone's doing an introduction, and I'm going to continue that. I'm going to now introduce people. But I'll have a couple of remarks first. When Lou Urenick first asked me to moderate this panel, I have to admit that I had a moment of hesitation. I grew up in journalism at a time when there was a long, respected tradition of journalists writing books, and it had not occurred to me that there was something new in daily journalists turning to write a book. For me, dating to my college days, when I was studying modern Chinese history with a dream of someday becoming a China correspondent, there were giants of journalism who had written epical books that had shaped the way millions of Americans looked at China and the Chinese communists. To mention a couple, in 1938, Edgar Snow, then the chief Far East correspondent for the London Daily Herald, stunned Americans with his book Red Star Over China, his exclusive first-hand account of Mao Zedong and the rise of the Chinese communists through the Long March. Virtually no one, even in China, had heard of Mao at that point, and Snow's description of Mao as a brilliant, romantic revolutionary created the popular image of Mao, now we'd call it the brand, for decades to come. A few years later, in 1946, a young, energetic, talented reporter for Time, Teddy White, who was from right here in Boston, who had been the magazine's correspondent in China during World War II, drew on his wartime reporting to reinforce this populist image of Mao in his best-selling book, Thunder Out of China. It actually sold more than 500,000 copies, a huge number for a serious nonfiction book at that time. I could recite a long list of these journalists who wrote successful, best-selling, and often prize-winning books based on their assignments. Just to mention a few, there was, of course, David Halberstam, turning his Vietnam reporting into the best and the brightest, or Anthony Lucas in Common Ground about the busing crisis right here in Boston, and more recently Thomas Ricks' Fiasco, using his years of covering the Pentagon for the Washington Post to write about the Bush administration's bungled Iraq war. If you will permit me a personal moment, in a small way I've tried this myself, of building on a body of reporting to write books. First, I turned my years of covering China from Hong Kong and then Beijing to write China Alive in the Bitter Sea. And later I drew on my reporting about crime to write All God's Children, which Carol just mentioned. I could not have written either book without the years I put in as a correspondent at the New York Times. Although I'm retired, I'm now working on another book, as Carol mentioned, also drawing on my crime coverage. So for me, writing a book was a natural outgrowth of daily journalism. But under the constant prodding of my wife, Elizabeth, a reformed journalist from the Los Angeles Times, who's now a professor here at BU, as many of you know, I have come to realize that I am something of a dinosaur, at least a journalistic dinosaur. So I recognize that the traditional model of the journalist/book author may be headed for extinction. Today's news that the Christian Science Monitor is abandoning its print newspaper to survive only online is the latest evidence of what we all know is the incredibly shrinking newspaper and news hole. In the face of this unpleasant reality, it's a good thing that we are gathered here today to talk about what may be a new model, with the book possibly emerging as the last best home for journalism. I think our topic can best be understood as a question or series of questions, which I will put to our panelists. Can nonfiction books make up for the journalism deficit created by downsizing and disappearing newspapers? Are journalists finding that newspapers no longer have the space for public affairs reporting in real depth, or the financial pockets to encourage their reporters to undertake lengthy projects, or a willingness to grant book leaves as they did in the past? And as a consequence, are journalists more frequently turning to the book as the intelligent way to tell their stories? We are really fortunate to have a distinguished group of working journalists who are also book authors with us today. In the hour that we have as a panel, I'm going to introduce one of our panelists at a time and ask him or her to reflect on the questions I've just mentioned. for the grand time of no more than 10 minutes. At the end, that should allow us about a half an hour for a Q&A session with the audience. If I can interject here, I think our audience may also be interested in what drove each of our panelists to write their book or books. Was it a lack of space in your paper or magazine? Was it a lack of interest and support from your editors to cover your subject? Was it a lack of time to report and write at length so you could tell a bigger story the way you felt it deserved? Finally, do you sense that younger journalists are likely to give up on working for newspapers or magazines and turn to books either at an earlier stage in their careers or just go directly to writing books? And will this be financially possible? I'm going to do this alphabetically, so we'll begin with my former colleague at the New York Times, Stephen Greenhouse. Steve is the labor and workplace reporter for the New York Times, one of the last full-time labor reporters in the country. He joined the New York Times in 1983, is that right? And has worked as a business reporter, as the paper's European economics correspondent based in Paris, and then as a reporter in the Times Washington Bureau, covering, among other things, the Federal Reserve and later the State Department. His first book, The Big Squeeze, Tough Times for the American Worker, was published by Knopf just this past April. It is a stunning and deeply disturbing account of the contradiction undermining our economy. Growing corporate profits and worker productivity over the last 3 decades, while worker pay has languished. I should add that Steve has both a master's in journalism from Columbia and graduated first in his class from the New York University School of Law. Steve.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm honored to be here. I wanted to be here with Fox and all these other distinguished panelists, and it's nice to see so many people are still interested in books. So sometimes I think that this panel has been misnamed. Sometimes I think it should have been called the nonfiction book as the last refuge for journalism, or perhaps more appropriately, maybe the nonfiction book is the last best home for serious information. Because unfortunately, as newspapers are declining and as fewer people are reading newspapers, there's still in many ways a hunger, including among many college students, for repositories of serious information. And many newspapers, unfortunately, are not as great a repository, a source of serious information as they were 10 and 20, 30 years ago. So that in ways makes the role of books that much more important. Fox and I conversed last week, and I agree with Fox that it's not new for journalists to write nonfiction books. You know, people have done that for decades, maybe even centuries, who knows. I think journalists have written books for 3 or 4 reasons over the years. One is money, to be venal. Another is ego, to also be sort of venal. But I think another big reason is people felt constrained by journalism. You could write a 1,000-word story, an 800-word story, a 1,200-word story, and if you're Edgar Snow or Fox Butterfield in China, you feel you have a lot more to say. 100,000, 200,000 worth of words to say, rather than just a 800 words every other day, every third day. I think more journalists are pushing to write books now for several reasons. One is there are a lot of very serious things going on in the world, and the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, the financial meltdown, a few problems in the White House, right, Ron? And people want to read far more about this. And I think that creates a hunger among publishers for serious books and a hunger among readers. But I also think other reasons more journalists are writing books now is that our wages have not gone anywhere in the last, I'm being very frank, our wages have gone nowhere in the last decade or two. And I think people see books as a way to supplement our non-raises in our jobs. And also, and I've heard this, and this will sound perhaps a little superficial, I apologize. You know, people keep, and you use this word with regard to Edgar Snow, so I could use it. You know, people say, you know, with the decline of journalism and buyouts and push-outs and layoffs, everyone has to go about branding themselves, creating their brand. And I think people are looking ahead a decade or two and saying, well, I want to position myself to be a writer. Anyway, but I really think the main reason journalists write books is they feel that they have much more to say than they can say in their daily newspaper. And I know that's how I felt. 10, 15 years ago at the New York Times, a typical story you often might be assigned even 1,500 words for a fairly important story. Nowadays, very often for the same story, I might be assigned, you know, just 800, 900 words. And it's very frustrating. You feel that you can't write as nuanced, as comprehensive, as intelligent a story as you would like. And I think that's one thing that's pushed me and others to write books. Now, why did I decide to write my book in particular? You know, I've been covering labor and workplace matters for the Times now since the mid-90s. And the late 90s were a very good economic time for the nation. There's the high-tech boom, unemployment fell to its lowest rate in a quarter century. Wages were rising the fastest they had been in a quarter century. But then come 2000, 2001, 2002, with the bursting of the high-tech bubble, with the recession, with the rise in unemployment, I really started to see that things had gone seriously south for the nation's workers in many, many ways. You know, wages really were stagnant, health benefits were getting much worse, pension benefits, 401ks, I saw as a real problem. I started working on a vein of stories about Walmart, the great Walmart mistreating its workers, locking them in at night, making workers work off the clock. Then I discovered a whole bunch of respected companies, you know, Toys R Us, Taco Bell, Walmart, where their managers felt so much pressure to minimize payroll costs that they were literally erasing people's hours from their time cards. And I thought all this was outrageous, and I just had the sense that, you know, no one, you know, as Fox said, there are only 2 full-time labor workplace reporters left in the country, me and Chris Mayer at the Wall Street Journal. And I had this feeling that the nation isn't paying enough attention to this. Politicians in Washington weren't paying much attention to the plight of workers. Now they are, but 3-4 years ago when I set out to write this book, worker issues were really largely ignored. And I felt that there's this whole important trend that things are getting worse for the nation's workers that no one was really writing about except for Barbara Ehrenreich. And I thought, you know, I sometimes tell people that as a reporter for the New York Times, I'm paid each year to go out and write the equivalent of a dissertation. And I felt I had really developed this expertise in this field. So I thought I should write a book that really explains in detail exactly what is going on with the nation's 140 million workers, with, you know, the effects of globalization, immigrant workers, the Walmart effect, and last point. And in writing stories, I often, you know, would interview people and I'd say, this person has an incredible story. I wish I could write a 4,000-word magazine article about this person, but instead, you might have to boil down this person with a great story to like 3 paragraphs, 4 paragraphs. And I felt this desire to really expand upon what I wrote in many stories, and it was very liberating when I set out to write a book. And and when I remember writing my first chapter of 5,000, 7,000 words, it was humongously liberating to, you know, when you started writing something that was more than 1,000, 1,200, 1,500 words, and you really can write more intelligently. You can explain things in much greater detail. You can, you know, pull a big corpus of knowledge together in a way that you really can't writing episodically, you know, 800 words about this subject, 800 words about that subject for a newspaper. But I do think as we move from dead tree journalism to internet journalism, and as fewer people read newspapers, I think the nonfiction book becomes more important than ever, because, you know, we as a nation, we as a world really need people writing serious books about serious matters, so readers, so students, professors can learn what's happening in the world. Last little point. One worry I have is that, you know, if the Washington Post's are not paying for reporters or hiring reporters like Tom Ricks. The New York Times isn't hiring reporters like Michael Gordon, and there aren't people doing these important journalistic jobs, I wonder who is going to be able to write the definitive books 10 and 20 and 30 years now about future wars and about other very important events. Thank you.
So we're going to continue alphabetically. I think I'm right here, so that's you, Dick Lair. As many of you know, is a professor of journalism here at BU, following nearly 2 decades as an investigative reporter for the Boston Globe. And he was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. He is the co-author of Black Mass, a riveting account of the ugly alliance between the FBI and the Irish mob in Boston. That agreement resulted in, as many of you know, in betrayals, murders, a popular movie, and a still ongoing murder trial in Miami of an FBI agent. The gang's leader, Whitey Bulger, who is the FBI's chief informant, remains on the lam more than a decade later. Dick's current book is The Fence, a police cover-up along Boston's racial divide. It's a true life tale of the beating death of a Boston undercover police officer by his fellow officers who mistook him for the suspect he was pursuing. And it gets at racial issues in Boston. Dick?
Thank you, Fox. I have a couple of points I wanted to make that hopefully will add to our discussion today. And the first is playing off, Fox mentioned a couple of journalists he admired who had built upon their reporting to write books. And I would suggest that, going back, that in a way was the exception, not the rule. That for most of the 19th century or the mid-1900s, it was an era of the novel, and fiction writers were king of the hill, so to speak, of the marketplace, of what publishers wanted to publish. I know, growing up, that I idolized fiction writers and whatnot. And then, so in some ways, I think we're the beneficiaries of an explosion that became in nonfiction book writing from, say, the 60s, 70s on, that has different names, the new journalism, the writers like John Hersey, Tom Wolfe, people who adapted successfully the techniques of fiction writing, fact-rich narratives they produced, using scene, tone, dialogue, that made nonfiction books compelling bestsellers. I think the publishing industry went through a sea change and was eager and hungry for those kinds of books. And maybe to help illustrate this a little bit, I brought along the New York Times bestseller list from a couple, 1966 and 1970. And the list consisted of 2 categories. The first was fiction. The second was called general. I mean, nonfiction didn't even warrant what it does today. It's the second section. And in 1966, under the general category, you have a biography of Papa Hemingway, and you have a book by Arthur Schlesinger, 1,000 Days. And that's historian as journalist, I would argue, more than journalist as historian, as long-form narrative nonfiction book writer. Today, again, it's almost, I think we're part of a golden era of nonfiction book writing, which is great for all of us. And it's I think the title, The Last Best Home for Journalism, has a couple of meanings. Once these books took off and there was a market for us, the newspaper, the stories in the paper became that proverbial first page of history. Well, then we could finish the story in long form, in a book, and in that sense it was the last best home. But it's taken on, I think, and added a newer and maybe more desperate meaning in the sense of our shrinking news hole that we're all going to be talking about, Steve's talked about, that there's going to be less and less of that first page in the newspaper, and we're going to have to, hurry up and get to the book or something to truly tell the story. So that's one point I wanted to make, and the other is a point that, and I think this is good news as far as the viability of nonfiction books, is something I learned in the books I have written, based originally on reporting in the newspaper. They're very local stories. They tend to be Boston-based. And the one book that Fox mentioned, Black Mask, about the FBI corruption here in Boston. This is a story that for most of the 90s, and especially in 1998, was like one of the biggest stories in town. It was covered day in and day out, exhaustively, in print and broadcast media. I was part of the coverage at the Boston Globe. When it came time to writing a book, I can remember thinking, is there anything else? Everyone knows this story. Is there anything left to say? With a colleague, Jerry O'Neill, we went ahead, and of course, we get to do some new reporting and reveal a lot of new details. Nothing I would call a smoking gun, so to speak. But to my surprise, and I think to our encouragement here to write books, even a story that's been playing out day and day in your local press or national press, is you had all these people who think they knew the story, and suddenly they read the book, and then they came away really knowing the story. It was a chance to, again, employ some narrative nonfiction writing techniques, to have a story arc, to put it into larger context. There was a way to spread your wings. And the book did really well, happily. And I was a bit surprised by that, because I thought if there was ever a story that had a saturated local marketplace, it was this one. And yet the book did really well, has done really well. And I think people who even thought they knew the story would come up and talk about, I never knew this. And you're able to tease out larger, more, and illuminate more important, what I would argue more important themes about, the FBI and law enforcement and all that kind of stuff. So those are really the 2 points I wanted to add.
Thank you, Dick. So next up on our list is Linda Robinson. Linda is an author now at the Johns Hopkins School for Advanced International Studies and a contributing editor for U.S. News and World Report. She is a former Nieman Fellow at Harvard, a senior editor at Foreign Affairs, and long worked for U.S. News and World Report, serving as Latin America Bureau Chief in the 1990s, and then after 9/11 covered the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, specializing in terrorism and national security. Her most recent book is Tell Me How This Ends, General David Petraeus and the Search for a Way Out of Iraq. She also wrote Masters of Chaos, The Secret History of the Special Forces, which was a New York Times bestseller. So, Linda.
Thank you very much, Fox. I'm delighted to be here. I wanted to start off just by asking how many of you are involved in the field or studying the field of journalism at this point in time, just so I have a sense. Good, okay, thank you. What I'd like to do is offer a few thoughts for these general questions that Fox has posed to all of us. Try not to repeat points that have been made, and then I'll talk a little bit about my specific path through the journalism world and how and why I wrote the books that I did. I think this week the news about the downsizing of all of these really important journalistic institutions is a perfect backdrop for this discussion today. In my view, there's just no longer any debate about what is happening in our industry. It's really the staffing of all of these organizations is diminishing, and the willingness of organizations to invest in news gathering, particularly international news gathering, which is what I've focused on in my career, is declining. And I think that makes the premise of this panel discussion roughly correct, namely that those who are engaged in journalism and nonfiction writing in general are increasingly going to have to look for other homes than the daily paper, the weekly magazine, the institutions that have, at least in my lifetime, supported the eventual production of books. From my particular standpoint, I feel this change has come for me at a perfect juncture. I've had a career of 20 years of field research, in essence, that has put me where I want to be right now with a career largely of book writing. But I think that it's scary times ahead for people who are entering into this. And what I probably, if you could allow me my crystal ball, I think there'll be a lot of people practicing journalism in the future who will have multiple lily pads, perhaps hang their hat at a think tank, a foundation, a school, such as a journalism school, and then do reporting and writing on a freelance basis for various organizations. I just don't see the willingness of many publishing outfits to fund serious news gathering that is the basis eventually for any book. I mean, you cannot write a good nonfiction book without the research. Also, we will be reliant much more on the publishers themselves, and one hopes that we continue to have a book publishing industry that is willing to provide advances to authors that will fund not only the writing, but in many cases, the fact gathering, the research phase. You will be fortunate to hear this afternoon from my publisher, Peter Osnos, who's here today, and the founder of Public Affairs Books, which published both of my books, and has been a real boon to journalists in this field, because that has been one thing. Peter Osnos, as a longtime journalist, has gone out of his way to find good authors with good stories to tell. But I am very, very pessimistic about what is happening in our profession. My first book, Masters of Chaos, I wrote in 2003. It was published in 2004. The reporting for both of my books actually was largely financed through being a staff reporter for U.S. News and World Report. In the case of Masters of Chaos, the magazine was willing to give me an unpaid leave to do the actual writing. It was a very short time frame. My agent was amazed that I was able to write the book in that short of time. Had it taken longer, I'm not sure if the magazine would have been willing to keep me on the string and give me that leave to do it. And in the case of the second book, there just wasn't that tolerance, and there were other writers at my magazine who were also wanting to write books, and the magazine was just unwilling to go that distance to let the writers have the time off. And I'm not alone. I mean, I think many people may know of David Cloud, who joined the New York Times and then wanted to write a book with Greg Jaffe, and he was forced to leave the paper because they would not give him the leave to do that project. I have another colleague, Sean Naylor, who wrote a book, Not a Good Day to Die, some of you may know, about Afghanistan, and he had an unexpected, or what his Army Times is his employer, and they were surprised at the success that he achieved with his book, and so they let him know that for his next book they were going to be looking for a cut of the profits. So you actually are, I think, seeing an environment where, far from sort of giving writers, reporters some slack, some time off to write, they may be increasingly looking at their star writers as a revenue source for their extracurricular activities. And I was blessed, I should say. I have been very fortunate throughout my career to have editors who have supported not only writing, but also traveling to speak at panels like this, write for journals and so forth, and they just saw it as part of the outreach that journalists do, you know, not just in terms of the crass advertising, your name is known, your magazine's name is known, but just the interaction. You're going to meet people at conferences, you're going to pick up information, you're going to pick up sources, and there was a very generous approach to that, I think, for the 2 decades of my journalism work. In my case now, I have, just to tell you a little bit about the process that I engaged in with my latest book, Tell Me How This Ends. I had been covering the Iraq War since 2003. I'd also gone to Afghanistan, but in the latter part of the war, I really started focusing very heavily on Iraq. I think in my view, from kind of a historical standpoint, there's no question but what this war is the equivalent of the Vietnam War for our generation. And I fully believe that devoting that amount of time to understanding this war and reporting on it was a choice that I wanted to make. And it was actually Public Affairs who approached me about writing a book after General Petraeus was named to become the successor to George Casey in Iraq. And I really didn't hesitate very long before saying yes, because for me it represented the classic opportunity to pull together the reporting that I had done, to focus in a way that I'd be free of deadlines and pressures to report sort of snippets of this story, that I could really try to understand this very complex war that had been through many phases, and try to have my say, try to encapsulate what this war, what the dynamic of the war had been, and what the end game is likely to be. And I'd be happy to talk more about that specifically, but for me, the other key point was, when do we publish? And I wanted to be part of the election year debate about Iraq, and to have the book out so it would inform some of the choices facing the next administration. So that set up maybe not quite as arduous a deadline as I underwent to produce my first book, but a pretty darn stiff deadline. And there was really no way that I could have done much journalism while writing this book. U.S. News did publish a number of stories as I was making my trips back and forth to Iraq, but that was really very much the side show for me. They also excerpted the book when for serial rights, as they had done with the first book, and then since I've published the book, I've done a number of spin-off articles for the Washington Post, Outlook, and Foreign Policy, and other places. So there still has been journalism going on, but the book has really become the main focus. And I think given the number of books that are out that are really addressing the issues of the day, my view is this is, I think, occupying an increasingly large place in the policy shaping publishing that's going on. I think the books have far more impact. You still have some stellar in-depth articles coming out, some investigative journalism, but in my case, I saw a dramatic decrease in the space allotted to stories. And as any of you know, who pick up news magazines, they're much thinner now than they used to be. When I started at U.S. News, my first story was Just Cause, the Panama invasion in 1989. And I was regularly given cover stories in 7, 8, 9 pages to write about any number of topics regarding Latin America, which I covered at the time. At the end of my time as a staff writer there at U.S. News, boy, you were lucky to get 4 or 5 pages, and that had to be a big story. They're even running cover stories that are just 5 pages. So I hope you have a mixture of optimism and pessimism from my remarks, because I'd like to convey both. It's just that you have to look for different ways to do the good work. Thanks.
Thank you, Linda. Now we turn to Charlie Savage. Charlie is now a Washington correspondent for the New York Times, as those of you who may have read the New York Times this morning would know. Charlie graduated summa cum laude from Harvard College and later earned a master's degree from Yale Law School while on a Knight Foundation Journalism Fellowship. He began his journalistic career with the Miami Herald and then covered national legal affairs for the Boston Globe. Charlie's well-known work on the Bush-Cheney administration's effort to expand presidential power for the Globe won the Pulitzer Prize for National Reporting. The book that he wrote, growing out of this reporting, Takeover, was named one of the best books of 2007 by both Slate and Esquire. So, Charlie.
Well, so to pick up on some themes we've already heard and maybe push them a little further, I mean, we're all reflecting on this sort of interesting title of this panel discussion, The Last Best Home for Journalism, and I almost wonder if maybe more accurately, it's the last man standing for serious journalism as our industry dies, and there's no two hands about it. But the problem with this, and Linda alluded to this a little bit about her position now and being able to write a book about the things that she's been covering for U.S. News, is that I don't see how these kinds of books exist without the predicate of periodicals, of journalists covering things on their own, just in a day-to-day tidbit way, and developing ideas and seeing the story. You don't see the story until you've been reporting on it for a long time. Most of the time, it's your own work that throws into these books. In some cases, like with Ron, he only writes book at this point, but I think I'll be interested in hearing what you have to say. But I think that those of us who have been engaged in trying to understand what the Bush administration has been doing behind closed doors the last 8 years, there's maybe a dozen journalists who've been sort of obsessed with this stuff, and it's almost like it's a team effort. We're all finding little pieces of the puzzle and putting it out there, and it locks in with someone else's little piece, and then both journalists understand it better. And so even for that kind of a book, I think it requires a whole lot of work by colleagues as well to sort of bring out little tips of icebergs here and there until the whole shape starts to come into view, and then you can go and push hard on a particular strand of it and come up with new nuggets and new news, but it's all against the context of working mainstream media. And so it has to be figured out, but and hopefully it will be figured out, but the news is worse every day rather than better. And so is it in fact the last best home, or is it something that is going to also shrivel up in the same way that a certain bug dies because of environmental contamination and has rippling consequences through the ecosystem, as the various animals that eat that bug and then to eat those animals also suffer the consequences. So that's pretty pessimistic. But I just can't imagine that society does not want and need serious information gathering about what's happening and synthesizing of little bits of information that are meaningless among themselves but form a mosaic that shows something quite startling when someone does the work of putting it together. So on the far end of this, it's going to work out, and books are going to be a huge piece of that, there's no doubt. I'll just segue from that into my own story of how I got into writing. My book is sort of an illustration of how it's not like if I just sat around and decided I wanted to write a book in a vacuum, this would have been possible at all. So I was covering, in 2005, the McCain torture ban debate in Congress as sort of part of my general interest in 9/11 legal issues in a small scale kind of way. And that was, of course, you remember, the White House strongly resisted Senator McCain's attempt to make clear in the law, which most people thought was already clear, which was that the U.S. cannot torture, and to close some legal loopholes that have been revealed during Alberto Gonzalez's confirmation hearing to the Attorney General. That whole debate culminated in the Republicans and Democrats coming together in the Congress and overwhelmingly voting for McCain's legislation, so much that even if the White House had wanted to veto it or had tried to veto it, it would have been easily overridden because the votes were overwhelming. And so Bush called everyone into the White House, called McCain in, called the media in, shook hands and said, I'm accepting this after all, you win, I lose, let's move on. And we all thought the story was over, except after everyone went home and the cameras were turned off and so forth, Bush issued this thing called a signing statement, which basically had no one outside the executive branch had been paying much attention to ever. Turns out it's sort of an official legal document that instructs the executive branch how they are to implement new laws. And in this one, he told CIA and military interrogators that the law was unconstitutional. Even though he had signed it, it was restricted his ability to carry out his duties as commander-in-chief, and therefore it wasn't a law at all, and they should pay no attention to it if they received orders that seemed to contradict this new statute. And I wrote about that, and that was pretty interesting, but I didn't realize how interesting it was because this is all about tidbits and gathering and slowly understanding what might be a book later on. So 2 months later, I was covering the debate over whether to reauthorize the Patriot Act, and everyone wanted the Patriot Act to be reauthorized in Congress. A few lawmakers in the Senate especially wanted some more oversight protections put onto it. The White House fought that too, but eventually, to break a filibuster, agreed to those kinds of restrictions, and once again had a big signing ceremony, and everyone thought the story was over, except once again, after everyone had gone home about 8 p.m., Bush issues a signing statement that says, these new oversight restrictions I agreed to get this out of the Senate are unconstitutional, so we don't have to obey them. And those two stories had gotten this huge response, and so I went off and I read all the signing statements. I wrote this big piece about where all the laws that the administration thought that it need to obey. At that point, already more than all previous presidents in U.S. history combined. And I kept asking why. I learned that this was coming primarily out of Dick Cheney's office, out of his top aide. David Addington was the primary author of these documents, and that, by the way, the legal theories that were being expressed in here that were sort of so radical had actually been laid down 20, 25 years earlier during the Iran-Contra scandal, when Addington and Cheney had been in Congress and had been the chief defenders of the Reagan administration's supposed right to ignore this law that cut off funds to the Nicaraguan Contras. And as I kept sort of exploring, sort of, well, where's this coming from and why, and how deep do its roots go, clearly way beyond 9/11 and those issues, it became clear that this was a piece of an agenda that Dick Cheney had formed 30 years earlier when he was the chief of staff to Gerald Ford at that post-Watergate, post-Vietnam moment when the imperial presidency that had grown up from Truman to Nixon during the Cold War was crashing down, and Congress was reawakening and performing real oversight on national security matters for the first time in decades, and was passing laws intended to sort of put the genie of unfettered presidential power back in the bottle. And Cheney had been outraged at that moment and had then spent the next 30 years of his career trying to refight those battles and to win them this time. You could see that in what he was doing during the Iran-Contra scandal. You could see that when he was telling Bush, one, that he should not go to Congress for authorization before launching the Gulf War, just as a demonstration that it didn't matter whether Congress authorized a war or not, the president could take us into a war on his own say-so. And now as vice president, he'd been in a position to bring this vision into reality, to act on these sort of radical legal theories, and by acting on them to lay down precedents demonstrating that they were true, that all presidents could always do these sorts of things. And the signing statements, which had been my little angle into that, because I'd sort of stumbled across them as a newspaper reporter, were really not that big of a deal in that larger context. They were one tactic among 30 or 40 tactics that were all simultaneously into play. And you could look across what my colleagues, including Ron and others, were writing about in many different contexts, from rising secrecy to the revelations about the warrantless wiretapping program, to increasing centralization of control in the White House over the executive branch, which manifested itself most famously in the U.S. attorney firings and the fights with the JAGs and the Pentagon about whether they could disagree with the president on what the Geneva Conventions meant or didn't mean, and many, many, many other things, like hundreds, maybe 500 newspaper articles scattered across Washington, all had this root. They were all connected by this theme that this was an administration that was looking systematically for opportunities to not just solve the policy problem in front of them, but to do so in a way that would increase presidential power for the long run, to leave the office stronger than it was when they got there, even if that brought them extra short-term political difficulties. So here's a situation where there wasn't that much information that wasn't already out there, in the same way as maybe the coverage of the FBI corruption scandal. But it was all being reported on just the trees, and the forest was totally missing. And there was no way to write a newspaper article that points out, hey, all this stuff means something. It's all pointed in the same direction. It can be organized and synthesized in a way to understand what's really been happening kind of one layer beneath the headlines. It required a book to do that. And that's why I wrote the book, and I'm very fortunate that I had the opportunity to do so. And I'm much prouder of that book than I am of a prize or any other things that I have. But it's not something that could have been done without a functioning newspaper, without a newspaper like the Boston Globe, a regional paper, not even a national paper, investing the resources to have a genuine reporting staff in Washington looking at stuff that wasn't just kind of what's our local senator up to today. And as that shrivels up, you know, who knows what books won't be written as a result. So with that, I will close.
That brings us to Ron Suskind, last but definitely not least. Where should I begin? Ron won the Pulitzer Prize for feature writing in 1995 when he was the senior national affairs reporter for the Wall Street Journal. He is a graduate of the University of Virginia and Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism. But you may be more familiar with Ron as a book writer. His most recent book, The Way of the World, A Story of Truth and Hope in an Age of Extremism, was published just this last August and is only the latest of his works to appear on the New York Times bestseller list. I can't really do it justice in a sentence or two, but to grossly over-summarize, it's an account of how America relinquished its moral leadership in the age of Bush, and also how America is losing both the battle with Al-Qaeda and its effort to prevent nuclear material from getting into the hands of terrorists. Ron's previous book, The 1% Doctrine, which also was on the New York Times bestseller list, looked at how President Bush and Dick Cheney improvised to fight a new kind of war after 9/11. An earlier book also made it to the Times bestseller list, The Price of Loyalty, George W. Bush, the White House, and the Education of Paul O'Neill. So, Ron.
Wow. I'm gonna announce my retirement now. I think this can't keep up, so I will get out while the getting is good. You know, I think, Charlie, your analogy is effective about the bugs. I feel like I should. I have a friend who's an entomologist, and I want to call him and say, what can we reintroduce? What kind of bug can we reintroduce into the ecosystem to help us here, to save us? You know, we are going through, we journalists, an extraordinary time of change, of havoc, and the announcement today about the Christian Science Monitor, the LA Times last week, Washington Post last month. You know, it's that guy Harold Kushner, the rabbi, he's from up here. I used to live up here, and he lived down the road. You know, what's that book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People? Well, bad things are happening to a good and an important industry that is not just the lynch sausage business. It's an important industry in the American polity, and it's American experiment in self-governance. You know, I mean, a guy no less than Jefferson, who had no love for the press and the James Calendars of his day, said he had to choose an institution, choose between a functioning government and a free press. He would choose a free press. This is how central it is to the thing we do, not just day to day, but certainly now in this election period, the holy writ of informed consent. And you know, the bad things that are happening to journalism, I mean, some of it is just happenstance, like a strong wind that blew from seemingly nowhere. You know, the model that supported good works in our industry, almost all of them, frankly, in newspapers and somewhat in magazines. Not that Ed Murrow didn't have a role too, but in terms of what really moved the ball forward, it was mostly newspapers and magazines, and newspapers primarily, doing the things that reporters have done every day for many years, that I did for many years of my life, 15 years. The model just is under siege, again, for no good reason. You know, the idea it would be supported largely by advertising and classified ads. Well, you know, Craigslist just wiped out a whole part of it, like whammo. It came up almost out of nowhere. That's a lot. And in terms of advertising, again, for no good reason, that model, and it's also on television, it doesn't work. Why? Because it's a forced model. It's as if you're going to buy this newspaper because you want to read the stories. On the opposing page, you're going to see the Bloomingdale's ad. And that's enough for Bloomingdale's. Well, it was. It's not anymore, and frankly, it's probably going to get worse. Now, if we're in an economic downturn and issues of discretionary income for companies especially, becomes an issue of real, of pinched regard, and what can we save? But at the same time, this notion of a functioning press, there's much of it that it's taken some work that I'm trying to feel hopeful about in this way. It's that the basic thing that we do, which is to gather evidence and to place it in many cases in a framework of a news story or in a wider story of us, of this time and place, this civilization, who we are, who we're becoming, who we've been. The need for that is no less. And in fact, I don't think it will diminish. The question is, who will be doing that going forward? Are we going to be able to hold on to the charge or not? There are competitors out there, and the competitors are some who frankly want to see our decline. They don't like us, especially those in power, as Charlie has experienced, and I have too. And some of them are delighted that newspapers are under siege, that reporters can't go out and spend the 6 months on the investigative piece. That's good for them. It's good for the clasp between these two arms of message discipline and secrecy. Once these hands get tight, it's hard to pull them apart. And it's not going to change, no matter who is the president. It's a strategic model. If you can do it, you will. That's the way power operates. They repeat it over and over again unless it can be shown not to succeed. But who owns the story? The fact is right now, if you take away what any number of reporters here or our friends at the newspapers do, Drudge, there's nothing on Drudge. It's the two-headed goat from Venus. That's all you get without the disclosures. Oh yeah, the New York Times or the Washington Post, and the same thing for Huffington for that matter. The source material that's driving so much of this vast and, non-monetized online planet, it comes from essentially the largely unrewarded traditional journalist. Unrewarded, that's probably not right. Certainly papers under constraint and in diminishing arrays of resources. I think some of it is going to take a kind of new ingenuity for us to think anew about how our value gets rewarded writ large. I'm an oddity. I'm an exception. Because I'm a newspaper reporter that sort of backed into books in the mid-90s. My first book, A Hope in the Unseen, comes out of a series in the Journal, in the Wall Street Journal, and it becomes a starting point, just like a lot of the books. You started at the paper, and as Dick said, and Charlie said, you want to then do more. It's much bigger. I'm seeing that now. And that becomes, a book that really is just a big story. People are desperate for those stories that have context. That's the key. Stories in which you've got narrative energy, but they are, reporting nightmares, of course. You just have to live inside of the shoes of people. You've got to pile the notebooks up to the ceiling. But then there's something that people say, I'll pay for that. That's a thing that helps me, changes me. I'll pass it to my friend. And it's something that we've done in newspapers more in the past than I think we do now. In the mid-1990s, the Wall Street Journal let me write 2 5,000-word narratives on an inner-city African-American kid. Think about that. He wasn't notable. He didn't shoot anyone. He wasn't, being looked at by the NBA. He was just a kid who wanted big things. That's the whole story. The world is full of those stories, and the audience actually is no less hungry for them. The question is, who will own them? And ultimately, who's going to get paid for them? Right now, there's so much fear and retrenchment that the newspapers are saying, oh, I don't know, we can't afford it because the model's not working. Again, we may not come up with a new bug to kill off what's happening in the ecosystem, and it'll be tragic, and the society will be less. But I'm still hopeful that we might find a way out of this very difficult period by figuring out ways that we can do the thing that we've long done with heft and with power. You know, in the recent period, you know, I was doing a different book, much more like A Hope in the Unseen, in 2002, you know, it was about an island in the middle of the Pacific, and it was, in a way, full of characters. And I sort of got drawn into this strange battle with George Bush, who I never met. I mean, it'd be nice someday if we could meet. I think in 6 days, the restraining order is off, so I can move within a few hundred yards of the White House. But what's interesting about this whole thing is that I come at it again in a very traditional way, and again it's sort of heartening. I mean, look, I'm trying to be hopeful because I need to sleep better than I've been sleeping, and hope is often a feat of imagination. You know, here's one where I sort of stumbled into it. I wrote 2 pieces for Esquire, because I write for magazines, sort of in between the books. And you know, the first one, I actually got in the big white building because they got confused. They read A Hope in the Unseen, and they're like, oh, he's like a book guy now. And they read A Hope in the Unseen, and they got kind of misty because there are parts of it where people, you know, cry, all people, Republicans too. And so there I was in the West Wing. You know, I had a desk across from Karen Hughes' office. It's amazing to think about now. You know, it's, hey, Carl, hey, nice to see you. Great tie, great tie. You know, but of course, the first story, they were shocked. Like, oh my God, enemy. But it didn't matter. Because, you know, ultimately, people want to tell the truth. The question is, how do you build a strategic model where that can happen? And folks started to come sort of out rather than me have to go in. And we're all in this, exactly as Charlie says, together as like a team. You know, Charlie will have something, or Bob will have something in one of his books, Woodward, or you know, there'll be, you know, Bart Gelman or Dana, and you're like, oh, look, ooh, it's related. You know, because we are, as a profession, all of us, in all the different ways we do it, in what I think is a seminal struggle for things that are bigger than even what we do as a profession, things that are at the core of what makes us who we are. And that's why I think that there will always be a need, and that it will be recognized, and someone will figure out a way to be paid for it. Maybe other than having the Bloomingdale's ad on the opposite page. And I'm looking for that still. One thing about books, which is why I think books provide a strange sort of fifth column here, is because there actually is a transactional moment with the book. Because people may buy the book. And that, you know, is something where a cash register is involved. Now, what that means is that the book writer can create a kind of, well, some people talk about brand, they can create a kind of autonomy whereby if they do a thing of value, the marketplace might reward them. And that will fund the thing ongoing from the publisher, as opposed to, again, the difficult, challenged economic model that many newspapers face. Now, having said that, you know, I see some perils in that model too, even though there's so much that sort of nicely encourages it in the way the world actually works now. Because if you write the book, then all the drudges are the Huffingtons and the people who have no real stuff. They cite it. Then people go and buy it. Then the publisher's like, oh, this is kind of neat. And maybe a newspaper reporter goes, well, I've written a story sort of in a related area, so now I'm strengthened by saying, oh, well, in Ron's book or in Bob's book, there's something here. And I put that in the story. Now, I, as a reporter doing a daily beat, can build on that and have that as a kind of club. So when I go to my source, I'm like, hey, it's already out. So now let's talk about the next follow-up question. That's kind of the way it operates. What that does is it gets people to buy a book. And that creates a separate kind of stream of sustenance. And that's why I think it has become a refuge for the kinds of things that frankly we used to do more of in the 10-part series in the New York Times. Remember, we used to do those. Isabel did a great one. Wilkes, I mean, you know, these like, and you collected them. Like, wow, that's really a book. Kind of a small book, but a book. You know, look at, you add them all together, that's, I don't know, 50,000 words, that's a book. My wife says write them shorter. Maybe I should think about that, write them smaller. You know, so people aren't like losing sleep for a week. And but now it's for us in the book trade to do that. In a partnership, I think, with our friends in other parts of the profession, and to try finally to move in a kind of simultaneity. You know, in a way, we're all doing things that are very, very similar. And part of what I hope is that somehow there will be, at this point, improbable and unseen moments of cross-pollination or new sort of avenues that will emerge where we don't have really a crisis of people not being supported by the society in doing something that the society actually does need. At some point, maybe they'll recognize that and maybe something will rise from ashes. But right now, it's not occurring. We're not at that brick wall moment yet, but we're moving toward it. And maybe one of you young people here in the room, you know, who, you know, you see the world differently than certainly an old guy like me or Fox, or, you know, we tend to see the world based on the lines that have been drawn. But among the younger people I meet, they kind of go, well, this is connected to that, and that's really part of that, and actually look at the audience I'm getting. And a hopeful sign that friends of mine in newspapers say, if you add in all the online readers, newspaper reading is up. Which I like that, right? That's good. It's amazing, though, that more and more people essentially are doing that in a place where there's no accretive pop. That's a huge problem. And some young genius hopefully will find a way out and introduce a new bug into the ecosystem so we can continue to do what we do. And that newspapers can continue to be, well, forget newspapers. That the act of gathering evidence and putting it together in a way that's comprehended, comprehensible, and of value can remain at the central place in who we are and in what we do.
Ron, thank you very much. I think we're on schedule. We still have half an hour for questions, so anybody?
I'd like to challenge two assumptions, unless I misunderstood, I heard. The first is the industry is dying, which is actually a quote from Charlie, and the notion that journalism equals newspapers. I think that was an assumption from what you were saying, and I'd like to challenge that assumption. There's a lot of press that we have free text, and there's a lot going on online. I just want to challenge that assumption, ask your thoughts about it. And the second assumption is that you make money doing nonfiction books. Because most people don't, or you don't make money until your third or fourth book. And it's incredibly expensive. So I just want to challenge that assumption that books are lucrative and that one gets paid in books for one's work and experience activities.
Do you want to ask Charlie
Well,
specifically the first part?
I hear you saying you want to challenge that assumption that the industry is dying, but I didn't hear you challenge it. Why is it not
Do you
dying?
really believe that the industry is dying and that the newspapers dying equals an industry dying?
Newspapers and print magazines? Absolutely. I mean, something else may rise in its place, and God hopes it does. But the whole,
Online journalism?
I mean, so here's the model, right? The model is we're going to subsidize long-form, serious journalism by bundling it together with last night's sports scores and yesterday's stock market tables and some comic strips and some other stuff and some classified ads in the Bloomingdale's ad. And together, people will want to buy this product for various reasons. And some people want the long-form journalism, but other people just want the stocks, and some people want the classified ads. Together, they form enough mass that you can afford to have some people on staff who write 5 stories a year, or who even write once a week, but do so in a way that is not just, super, the kind of news you would see in on TV in your local news broadcast, 30 seconds to the car crash. And what's happening is that model doesn't work anymore, and all those things that have been aggregated together have to be broken apart. And the question is whether there is really a sustained market when you don't have the subsidizing going on by these other things for just the serious long stuff. And it's true that you can put that stuff online and people can come look at it, and that's great, but can you monetize it enough to pay the rent and the health insurance and the kids' college tuition for the people who are producing it when it's not connected anymore to who won the baseball game last night? And I don't think you can. It by itself, you just, you can, okay, so bloggers are out there, but they've got to pay the rent too. So unless they're trust fund babies, they're not going to be doing this stuff. And so we have the model now that's being tried with the experiment of ProPublica, which is an attempt to have a stable of investigative journalists working online for the most part, without a profit model. And where's the money coming from? A really rich family handed them $10 million. And so that's great for those 10 people for the next 3 years, or however many they are. Maybe the rich family will write another check 3 years from now. But it's not going to replace what had been the model for the 20th century in terms of the sheer magnitude of numbers of people out there whose job it was to scour what was happening, to read the documents, to talk to the people, and to bring this information so that Drudge has something to work about. That model is dead, and I wish it wasn't the case.
If I define journalism as only newspapers, as opposed to newspapers, magazine, and online, I live online and read online vast amounts of things at this point. I write online periodically, even do, sort of conversations. The bottom line is that I agree with Charlie in terms of, funding the thing that ultimately brings the highest and best value. We are in an enormous challenge at this point. Having said that, the online universe, which is evolving, is providing, again, not mostly for pay, the journal charges, and that has been actually, at the beginning, people thought that was the wrong issue, wrong idea, but they sit around and say, hey, we're getting money, and people will pay if you have confidence that they will pay for a thing of value, and they have over the years. Maybe that will grow up as the model, but right now, you've got a bit of a kind of, free-for-all, where, you pick and choose, and you sort of go sift about, and you find things of value. They're connected to other things that are often extraordinary, but that's the real document. And look at this, and here's an expert who actually is the guy quoted, and look at what he has to say. That's terrific. And ultimately, I think newspapers can and should do more there in terms of building their online universe to say, look, it's not about the era of monologue, it's about dialogue, right? We grew up in the era of monologue. Here we've got this thing, it's on your doorstep, call me if you want. Dialogue is better, and I think everyone agrees on that in terms of the vast sort of population. They like to be engaged, and the dialogues are often fascinating and accretive, and they're bold, they move, they're shaped. But ultimately, I don't see that, at least right now, providing the central purpose that the funded, and sustained media has provided. Again, over the 20th century, and less so as we've moved forward into this one. And what's tricky about it is that what I find is online, and maybe this will change as people get more credentialed, or people start saying, well, no, that person, you shouldn't trust that person, but that person's always been right. And maybe some sort of meritocracy like that will grow up. I think it has in a way, but will grow stronger. is that what you've got is a difficulty where people who are actually professional, I'm a professional at this. I didn't just sort of wake up one morning and say, oh, this might be fun. I've been doing it for 25 years. And I'm much better now than I was in year 5 or even year 10. Just like any other profession, you get better at it. You learn things, often the hard way. You're like, now I understand, how to find what I need and how to frame it with more of the stuff that matters. The profession is under siege, truly. And when you get online, you're like, well, that's utterly ridiculous. But it's right alongside the thing that you may say is absolutely right. And there's no one to say, that's ridiculous, this is right, because we as the intermediaries, the newspapers, the networks, the major magazines, are getting cleaned away, washed away. Maybe we're at one of those crazy points where the evolution, the next stages are invisible to us but already on the way. Again, because there is a need and people do feel that. Look, in this election, you can hear that. I need to exercise informed consent. Where do I go to know what I need to know? I think there's a great hustle to manage that because there is demand. Again, it's a question of something that is bloodless and pitiless, markets and money, that is causing this thing to occur. And in some ways, it's a matter of saying, don't run from the beast. We in journalism, somehow you gotta own it. Face it and own it. And once you own it, you can make it dance. But we're not there yet. Right now, we're just in fear and flight for very good reasons.
I just want to add, journalism is very sick. The economic model for newspapers is a mess. I mean, a lot of newspapers are dying. Once great newspapers like the Philadelphia... I'm getting there. I'm getting it. Like, once great newspapers like the Philadelphia Inquirer, the San Jose Mercury News, they're not a shadow of what they once were. In terms of serious journalism that really uncovers wrongdoing and informs the public about what's going on so a democracy can run properly, I'd say traditionally newspapers have carried 80 to 90% of that burden. I mean, including TV and magazine. Online journalism, most of it is opinion. Very little of it is serious investigative journalism. I wish that maybe 10 years or 20 years or 30 years from now, some online journalists could uncover a Watergate or go to Afghanistan to examine whether Americans bombed a village and killed 20, 30 civilians. Online publications are not going to do that. Stepping back, I think we're having a real crisis of democracy because in many cities, the newspapers are no longer doing what they once did, really serving as watchdogs on what's happening in those cities and those states. And I think we're at a time when government is more powerful than ever, corporations are more powerful than ever, but the free press is weaker than it's been in decades. And I think we as a nation have to figure out, and I know Sarah Palin's going to accuse me of being a socialist for saying this, but the GM is sick. There's discussion of trying to rescue GM and Chrysler. The banks have been sick. There's discussion of we as a nation have to fix that. I think for the good of democracy in the future, I think we as a nation should think, is there a way to fix, to subsidize journalism perhaps in a totally non-partisan, non-ideological way? Because I would think many politicians are happy to see newspapers dying. Many corporate leaders, especially corrupt ones, would be delighted to see newspapers die. And and I think for them, online journalists, they're just fleas. They don't have enough power to really bother them. But if a Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, the New York Times, the LA Times, the Chicago Tribune comes after them, then they have to say, wow, this then they have to worry. But I think quietly many politicians are extremely happy to see newspapers dying.
I wonder if we could use the Starbucks model. Starbucks basically took a product that cost 30 cents and had people buy it for $4.15. Could we, because good information has been subsidized by advertising and it's so cheap, is it possible that we could develop grants and say to people, hey,
That's kind of what a book is, right?
Yes, although a book again has to, sometimes has to get to the lowest common denominator to get out there. I noticed that conservatives have been very smart in subsidizing the books that go to their ideology, and I wonder if we don't need to have either books on the left or books on the center subsidized in somewhat the same way.
That's a good question.
Starbucks doesn't have a competitor that's giving out great coffee for free. You know, we have their internet, which is giving out great stuff for free. So it's a very hard economic model to compete with.
Right, it's even worse, it's even, they're going to Starbucks, stealing the coffee, and then handing it out for free next door. It's literally like right next door, oh, it's free here, no, $4.15, what are you kidding? Yeah, look, I mean, it's this own the beast thing, and look, these are the kinds of ideas that'll probably be salvation, to say, now, is there a way we can, I hate to say it, but form a kind of cartel? You know, cartels actually work. You know, OPEC has done a nice job with its cartel, and you know, a cartel to say, look, you know, you can't have this stuff for nothing. All of our stuff, any of our stuff, because right now we're in a weird kind of separated and competitive, and well, let's see how you do, and let's see how I do. But the fact is, the whole industry is under siege, all parts of it, and you know, I mean, it's about definition of a thing of value, and somehow finding a marketplace definition of it that actually works and has legs. You know, and that, you know, is sort of it's a holy mission at this point, because ultimately, just what Steve says, you know, I couldn't agree more. You know, those in power are just delighted, and that's not nothing, because they're often people with their hands on the levers. You know, because they're not facing, on balance, the numbers or well-funded strength of reportage that they might have faced 20 years ago, where they're up against a little battalion. They're coming from all directions. And actually, when they come up with something, there's a clasp between accountability and transparency that really, with teeth, something that really matters. Well, we're far from that now. You know, and the fact is, they're delighted. They are delighted. They can move unfettered. The watchdog is gone. You know, they can attack us, you know, in all sorts of ways, and no one seems to mind. You know, and ultimately, message is a goal. And the goal, politically, of many of the managers out there is to make consent as uninformed as possible. That's the goal. You know, I want it to be based on how this guy looks. That's good. You know, I'd like to never have the informed question come at my man or my CEO. That's crisis.
I'll throw one thing out, since I've been the most pessimistic. This is a one-sentence thought. You know, the music industry was going through this in the late 90s because Napster was ripping off all their music for free. And as a college student at the time, I may have participated in that. But no one predicted iTunes and the iPod, which found a new model, and now everyone's buying music again. Because it's so ridiculously convenient. And they had to abandon the model, really, of the aggregated album where you got one good song and 9 pieces of filler, but it turned out people might be willing to buy more singles if all they were getting was the good stuff. You know, so who knows what's right around the corner.
All these stories are so great, people have paid to download them individually.
99 cents.
I would like to just add a couple quick points here, because I think that you will also be discussing this afternoon. The publishers will have, I think, a much better grasp of the business side of this. But the central point is there's no business model to replace the old one. Online revenues are a fraction of the old traditional media revenues. So that's fundamentally what's driving this. And I would say, yes, that all of those old publications, not just newspapers, is what has constituted journalism, and the new media hasn't yet found a way to finance itself. So that, I think, is the fundamental economic thing. But you also asked about the book world, and I think it's a marketplace too. Of course, you have to sell the publisher on your book proposal. And I think that I know from my experience, having come out of my Latin America coverage, trying to find a publisher for Colombia, for Cuba, no takers. I developed a lot of access and expertise in the Special Forces community. There was a market there, book on that. Iraq, I think this has been somewhat surprising to me, but I'm very glad that publishers have sprung for a whole new wave of Iraq books. I think that's very important and a sign to me that that part of the industry is healthy. Because what we had some very good books that essentially were about the first half of the war, but the war has undergone a profound change, and the figure of David Petraeus is one of great interest as well. But what we've essentially had is a profound change in the approach to the war, where essentially Petraeus stopped treating the Sunnis as the enemy. And this deserved to be chronicled, and thank God there are people out there who are willing to pay for books to have this phase of the war documented.
I see the publisher back here, Peter.
Well, I'm going to give you just a glimpse of the...
Louder.
I'm going to give you a glimpse of the discussion you'll hear this afternoon, I hope. But I just think you know, in reading about the Christian Science Monitor this morning and the whole long litany of despair, there's also a story that says that Google, can you not hear?
I can't hear you, I can't hear.
All right. There's also a story that said that Google agreed yesterday.
This is Peter Osnos.
Yeah, I'll be having something to say. I just wanted to point out that Google agreed yesterday to pay $125 million to the publishing industry and committed to paying royalties henceforth to all books that are digitized that they make available. Think about what an extraordinary breakthrough that is. And when you listen to the litany of despair, this happened yesterday because, unlike the newspaper industry, which said, go ahead and take the stuff, publishers sued. And yesterday Google agreed, assuming the court approves it, which of course they will, to put $125 million aside to create a registry. And henceforth, any one of the books on this dais that are digitized and you read online, they and we will get paid. So I agree, it is a very, very difficult time in the classic Metro newspaper world, but there's a lot going on, and that happens to be perhaps the best piece of news I've seen in a long time. So I couldn't stand waiting until this afternoon to tell you something. I share it with you now, and I'll go back to standing.
Yeah, I wanted to congratulate you first. This is the first sort of journalism conversation I've been in which the first hour and a half, the word blog has never been uttered. So I'm a little bit loth to, to bring it into the conversation. But I was struck by something Stephen Greenhouse said early on, which is sort of in his construction of his book and why he was compelled to tell it is that he came across these great stories and interviews and felt very frustrated by not having the ability to tell them the length they deserved and sort of the complexity that they held. Well, in many ways, when you talk to journalists who are blogging or bloggers, that's what blogs are now supposed to do. They're supposed to be the repository for those pieces of information and stories that you wouldn't necessarily get into the newspaper, but you want to say or want to get out. But the problem with that, I think as you well pointed out, is that those become diffused. When you have 100 million blogs and you have people who have limited time and don't necessarily know where to find those stories, the messages get diffused. So if indeed you don't have the resources provided by the newspaper, if the newspaper is telling you to put your quote best stuff or your remaining stuff into the blogs and it disappears there, I'm just kind of wondering where all of this starts to fit in this puzzle, this mosaic that we're talking about.
A brief answer. I don't begin to consider myself a blogger. Once in a while they'll tell you to write a longer version as a blog, but one never knows how many people read your blog items, and again, a big advantage of a book is you could take 8 blog items and 30 stories and another year of reporting and create this wonderful stew that satisfies you and you think will satisfy your readers, whereas a blog item there, a blog item there just doesn't cut it.
One of the things that I spent a year in 1999 spending a lot of time with a lot of internet types at the sort of things were exploding. And that was the first moment a lot of people in the Northern States said, boy, we're in trouble here, and sort of the Gutenberg moment has arrived, so to speak. And, you know, there was a lot of talk back then about a way that it's almost like a toll booth, that every time it's like your electric bill, kind of, you know, to make it very granular, the internet. So every time you read something, a little nickel went in the can, so to speak. So that activity, much more granular activity, that clearly was a choice, could be monetized. You know, the fact is that if we did that, for instance, I mean, look, I'd pay a couple bucks for a Charlie Savage store, you know? I mean, I think people will pay, especially if it can be done kind of nicely and invisibly. At the end of the month, they get their phone bill or their electric bill for what they do online. They like it. They live there. They spend their life there. You know, again, you know, for free coffee. But I think that they would pay. And I love what Peter said about, you know, Google. I think that's part of a process that's actually going on right now. And I think actually a part of it is sweeter the uses of adversity, if you will. The jewel in the toad's forehead, the second part of that Shakespeare one, is that people are going, huh, you know, this thing that I'm getting for nothing online, you know, I really can't do without it. You know, and I think there will be changes somehow, again, that we can't predict, coming from that. It's this period, though, of disruption right now that's the very, very, very difficult period, when great institutions that have the muscle to do something so central to a democracy, certainly, are under real siege.
Switch the topic a little bit. It's very depressing. There's a lot of students here that are young journalists.
Can you speak up just a little bit?
Yeah, there are a lot of students here, young journalists that are, you know, working with 800 words of bachelor's right now. How do you make that leap to a full-length book? How do you, what's the process that you go through? You're working for a small paper, but you've got a book idea. You're walking through that.
Well, I think we could all, you figure it out. I mean, I don't think there's any one formula, one track. In my case, it was, you know, starting off writing news stories, learning how to write daily journalism, and then being insatiable in a way, both in terms of what I wanted to know, but also how I wanted to express it and write it, and going from there to learning how to write longer, which was then the newspaper's Sunday magazine. Today it might be something online, an online version. But you've got to be thinking about it, and you've got to practice it. And then after the magazine articles, you know, maybe I can do a book. I mean, it's all about doing and practicing. Like Ron says, you know, been in this business for 25 years, a lot better now than it was 20 years ago. I don't think, there are very few people who I think who can make that leap and have, shortcut it right to the, I mean, they're geniuses and prodigies or whatever. I mean, of course there are those, but most of us just learn by the doing of it and the painstaking effort involved.
I would add that I think that's exactly right. You have to be prepared to make that investment of time and work on the craft. But also I think being able to stake out a story, a turf, a beat, something that's your own, and really become an expert on that. I know in terms of my first book, it was actually the Neiman Fellowship year that allowed me that extra time. I had done a lot of reporting in Latin America on insurgencies, I'd made some contacts, but it was really then that year where I was able to do some research that got me the grounding for the Access and then the book that eventually developed on the Special Forces. And so I think that having kind of a 5-year plan is a good thing. And of course, we're talking about going the way of the dodo here, and the beat structure is breaking down at a lot of places too. But to the extent you can find a job at a place that has a beat, Justice Department, whatever it is you want to cover, so that you can develop those sources and that expertise, that's then going to give you, along with your clips, the ability to go to a publisher and say, hey, I really know this, I know this well, here's my story, this can be a book.
One other quick thought. When one writes for a newspaper, one writes for editors, and editors often really help teach you how to write and how to keep it short. Bloggers often read like verbal diarrhea. You'll be 2,000 words, which should really be only 400 or 500 words. So I worry that all these bloggers who think they're going to become book writers someday, don't have the discipline that's really required.
I would say one thing that, I just wrote my first book, right? And when I sat down, I didn't know how to write a book. When I finished it, I knew how to write a book. And in the process of that, I wrote a lot of stuff that I threw away at the beginning until I sort of started to get it. And so from a really reductionist craft point of view, if you're learning how to write 1,000-word articles, 1,200-word articles, you're learning how to write a book because a book is a bunch of those connected together, for one thing. And and the problem is, how do you connect them together? It's hugely important to know where you're going and to outline ahead of time, I think, because then you can break it down into little bite-sized pieces, and it's just like writing a bunch of articles. And one of the sort of really simplistic frames that works really well, I found, I don't know if you've had narrative journalism classes or classwork yet, but where the sort of model of having alternating modules of anecdote or story, and then pulling off for a module of exposition, and then a sort of a second module that picks up chronologically from the first story, and then a second module of exposition that goes off and tells you something else, just as sort of straight information. And that frame of story that is interwoven with the information propels the thing forward, and you can just keep adding modules at the end of that to make the story as long as you want. That doesn't just work for magazine-length articles, that actually kind of works for a book as well. And it's just that the modules are 1,000 or 1,500 word components, maybe, instead of 300 words. And you can sort of construct chapters that have an arc to them. And it sounds very reductionist, but it actually, when you start to have organizing principles like that, and you can break the big thing down into little parts, it's not so overwhelming.
Let me just add a quick thing to what Charlie said, is that one of the things that I found in the books is not only exactly to have kind of a roadmap, but to also, along the path as you're reporting, to be ready to do a paradigm shift of sorts. Is to say, it's not exactly what I thought when I was starting out. Because often the best stuff comes from those moments of surprise. Because frankly, your expectations, if you have them, probably people more broadly have them. And when you find yourself saying, oh, perfect, that little bell should go off. Perfect for what? For whom? For what conclusion? Because I think often the best stuff happens when the reporters, once you're in it, deep in it, you're like, huh, it's actually different, it's quite different. And that ends up being the thing that shines most brightly. Secondly, the fact is what Steve says is absolutely true. Lean. You learn as a reporter when you come back and you say to the city editor, huh, it's the best story I've ever seen. And he's like, great, 60 cents. Give me 600 words. I'm like, 600 words? I can't clear my throat. But you do it in 600. And it's harder to write short than long in a way, because you've got to be focused on the lean, on every word being of value. And the books that work actually are long sort of journeys of very lean prose. Because in a way, you've got to think of yourself sitting in front of a room full of people on their Barca loungers on the 722 out of Greenwich or wherever it is, or sitting at their lunch table. They're all suffering from attention deficit disorder, all right? And when they go, it's it, you lost, you're done. Now, the nice part about the online world, I have to say, is that there's no more generally, I don't think there's any more qualitative business in a way than what we do, because it's under your name, and either it works or it doesn't. And it's recognizable pretty much instantly to all sorts of people. That's something you won't find in almost any other profession. They're usually group affairs. Who knows who gets credit? It's often the person who happens to be at the top or wins the musical chairs game. But you will be judged on the thing you can present, which is great, whatever you get paid. And in this era, if you can manage that in the widening portal of the online world, it actually gives you avenues in to show your stuff. Again, if you're disciplined and if you show real ardor, that someone can look at it, someone at the New York Times or the Boston Globe or the Wall Street Journal, God, that's good. That's good. That's in a way a kind of beam of light, because you can get into it and try it Even though you may not have good editors to say, that sucks, do it over, which you need. You're gonna have to do some of that on your own or get someone to do that for you. But if the product is good, it's your name on the top.
The second comment or tip that I'd give in terms of what goes hand in hand with the practicing and doing of it is reading. Find yourself a model. If you have a book-length idea or an idea that you think has potential as a book and you've never done a book, well, read a Susskind. Read people that turn you on, and then read it again. And it's like watching movies and figuring out how they do their craft. It's break it down. Charlie calls them modules. We call them blocks. How did they block this chapter? And I think that's indispensable. You cannot learn by doing without reading how others have done it.
Reverse engineering.
We have time for one last question. Somebody back here, ma'am.
Yes, with what you're talking about, the death of the industry and this inundation of online propaganda or just information coming at readers from all angles, I just want to get your opinions on how this affects the reader. How are we supposed, some people aren't able to differentiate between what's good, serious journalism and what's not.
That's a very, very good question. It's like, if you grew up watching lousy sitcoms or great, Fellini movie, how does one learn what's good journalism? I think, maybe in grade school, teachers or in middle school, teachers should start steering students to read some good newspaper articles and try to teach, this is fair, this is balanced, look at, how they try so hard to, get to the facts and compare it with something that's more slanted. But in this day and age, where everyone can do whatever he or she wants, some people might think Drudge is the model of journalism, and it's hard to unteach that. And we could, dead tree newspaper people can continue, beating our heads against the wall and let people think this is serious journalism, this is neutral journalism, this is a model. And I think that message gets through to some people, but it's not getting through to all people. But we have to just keep on trying and trying.
The other interesting thing that's happening because of the cacophony of information that we absorb on the internet is that I think people's attention spans in general are not what they used to be. All of us. There was an awesome article on the cover story for the Atlantic Monthly a few months ago called "Is Google Making Us Stupid?" And they didn't mean Google, they meant online browsing, because we're so used to just, little bits here, little bits there, rapidly sort of surfing around. And the minute your interest flags, there's always 17 other things competing for your attention. It's very hard. I find it much harder today than it was for me 10 years ago to sit down and read a book all the way through, because there's so many distractions, and the minute my attention flags, I'm checking, the sports scores or whatever. And so that also presents challenges for the that's one of the reasons, in addition to the shrinking news hole, that you don't see the 10-part newspaper series anymore, because there was a sudden realization, I think, that no one reads the damn things. They became increasingly just sort of written to win prizes, and they were for the audience of the committee that was being forced to read them. And so that presents real challenges to the book writer too, because on the other hand, you're going to have a much more intimate relationship with the person who chose to pay $15 for your book. They've made the investment, but that's an audience that's much smaller than people who get the paper thrown on their front porch or sitting down in front of their computer. It's not, I don't have a solution to it, but I just think that's another sort of way in which the world is changing. Our brains are being rewired by our internet habits, and so we have to think about that as we write lengthy pieces.
Well, I want to thank the panel. Thank